All right, guys, today we're going to be talking about our concept 3 notes for our ecology unit, and that is going to be about population growth patterns. All right. So population growth patterns are incredibly important to biologists because they help us kind of predict trends and see things that are going to be happening. All right, so a population is just a group of organisms that are all living in the same space. Now, those organisms have to be the same species to be considered a population. Remember, if we have different species all living in an area, we call that a community. So a population is only about a single species, whereas a community is about multiple species. So we like to study this and understand what's going on with populations because there can be ripple effects throughout the environment because of population changes. We call those trophic cascades. So a classic example of this is when all the wolves were hunted out of Yellowstone Park, and it completely changed that environment because now the prey animals had no predators, and so they basically could eat all the plants and everything they wanted, and it completely changed the way it looked there to the point where a lot of runoff was happening. It was actually changing the course of rivers. So when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone Park, it actually brought the prey population down, allowed vegetation to grow, that prevented runoff, and is actually changing the course of rivers. So that's a classic example of why population growth is very, very important. So we can kind of categorize population growth into two different categories. One can be exponential growth. So that's where you have growth without limit. Okay, so if you think about 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 16, 16 times 16 is a big number, that big number times that big number is an even bigger number, and it keeps growing, growing, growing without end. All right. Another type of growth is going to be logistic growth. So that's where you're going to have your initial burst of growing quickly, but eventually you're going to hit what we call the carrying capacity. So that's basically the maximum population that a given environment can support. Another example we can use right here is to talk about exponential and logistic is disease. So currently we're all sitting at home. We're not in the classroom together due to the novel coronavirus that causes the disease COVID-19. So at the beginning of this, on March 13th, when we all went into lockdown, the reason for that was disease and viruses can move through populations exponentially. So if you have all these people coming in contact, you can have exponential growth, which is really, really bad as far as taxing resources in the healthcare field. So when we talk about flattening the curve, we're literally trying to lower the carrying capacity of the virus by not coming in close contact with each other, and that, like you can see here, will limit the curve or flatten the curve. That's why we use that terminology. So population density is another measure of populations that we can use. So in a highly dense place like a city, you can see this thing over here where this would be a high population density. There are a lot of organisms per area. So that's how we calculate it, the number of organisms divided by the area. And population density can be limited by the amount of births that are happening in an area, the amount of immigration that's happening into an area, so the amount of organisms moving into the area, the amount of death that's happening in the species we're looking at, and the amount of immigration that's happening in an area. So that would be things moving out of an area. We can use this handy dandy equation here to actually calculate the growth rate in a given area. So if there's a lot of births and immigration, our population is going to go up. If there's a lot of death and immigration, our population is going to be down. So therefore our population density will go down. A classic example of this that demographers are interested in is things that happen maybe after a financial crisis or a recession. So back in 2008, during the Great Recession, somewhere like Washington, D.C., that was relatively unhit, their population grew a lot because a lot of people were immigrating to D.C. because there were still jobs there. Whereas maybe a city like Detroit was experiencing a lot of immigration, and their population has been dropping for a while now, but that was really like a big factor. Okay, so limiting factors, these are things that are going to affect the carrying capacity in a certain environment. Okay, we can classify these as biotic or abiotic. So maybe a limiting factor could be abiotic, like there's not enough water in an area, so that's going to lower the carrying capacity. If you think about a desert versus a rainforest where there's a lot of water, that's going to have a very high carrying capacity. There's going to be a lot of animals there. Another limiting factor can be biotic, so maybe something like disease. If a disease is running rampant, then our carrying capacity is going to be significantly lowered. Like we could think about, I don't know, Europe during the bubonic plague. That was lowering the carrying capacity significantly. All right. Limiting factors can also be classified as density dependent or density independent. So we'll get into that. So a density dependent limiting factor, it's going to be something that's going to have an effect, a stronger effect if the population is denser. A really good example of this is going to be disease. So once again, if we use the coronavirus as an example, we can go back to the beginning of this, and where it was really bad was a place like New York City where it's very, very dense. Whereas places like maybe Texas or Arizona that were a little bit more spread out than somewhere like New York City, they weren't feeling those effects initially because their populations weren't as dense and they weren't coming in contact with people that had it. Eventually, obviously, that caught up and it affected everyone everywhere. All right, so a density independent limiting factor is going to be something that's going to happen and cause changes regardless of the amount of organisms that are in that area. So these tend to be like natural disasters. So weather changes, climate changes, pollution. So something like a forest fire, like the ones that are going on right now in California and Washington and Oregon, those are going to be density independent. They're going to have large effects regardless of the density of the animals there. Whereas something like competition between organisms can only happen if there's a lot of density and there's a lot of organisms there to compete with one another. Or this example of predation is only going to happen if there are predators to eat the prey, like our example of Yellowstone National Park. So a stable ecosystem, this is an ecosystem that's relatively constant, okay? It's not changing a lot over time. And kind of the birth rate, the immigration rate, the death rate, the immigration rate, those are going to be pretty much the same and kind of equalized. That's not to say that it isn't changing, but it's to say that it's relatively constant what's going on there throughout time. So this would be like an old growth forest, or maybe even a mature coral reef. And finally, we get to this last idea of survivorships. This a lot of students find confusing, so we're going to make sure we really hammer it down. So what this graph is showing you is the potential lifespans of organisms. So if you look here, this would be basically the number of individuals that are going to be born. And then this down here, let me move my head here. This down here is going to be the percent that make it to their potential lifespan. So if we imagine 100 individuals are born in all three of these different survivorship curves, and maybe they can all live to be 100 years old, more individuals, more of that initial 100 are going to make it to 100 years old in a type 1 survivorship curve, whereas maybe in this type 3 survivorship curve, a lot more are going to die when they're babies, and only very few will make it to 100 years old. So this is a pretty interesting idea because it can tell us a lot about what's happening with the organism, and it can tell us a lot about kind of their evolutionary history and the selective pressures that are on them from the environment or maybe their predators. So in a type 1 survivorship curve, you're going to have late loss. That means a lot are going to live through childhood, and you're going to have very heavy parental care. You're also going to have very few offspring because you're providing so much parental care. You can't have a lot of offspring and care for them to that depth to ensure that they survive childhood. So a type 2 survivorship curve, this is going to be constant loss. So if you look at our graph here, this is basically a 50-50 chance of surviving at any point in your life, regardless of how old you are. So when it says mortality is unaffected by age, what that means is as they age, it doesn't really change the likelihood of whether they're going to die or not. So this is an animal that maybe has medium parental care, maybe doesn't have a lot of offspring. An example of this would be a lot of birds, a lot of small mammals, some lizards, maybe some types of snakes. So, you know, some of those might die when they're young due to being preyed upon, but a lot of them will live to an old age. And finally, we have a type 3 survivorship curve. So this is going to be, you can see this here, dropping off. Okay, it's like a reverse exponential growth. Okay, you can see this dropping off rapidly right after birth. So you're going to have early loss. You're going to have a whole lot of offspring. And if you're going to have a whole lot of offspring, you're going to have very low parental care. There's no way the parents of these organisms can provide individualized care to all of the offspring they're going to have. So why is this important? Survivorship curves are important because they can kind of tell us a little bit about the evolutionary history or the selective pressures on those animals. So we can equate different reproductive strategies to these different survivorship curves, okay? So in a type 1 survivorship curve, these animals are going to be very, very close to their carrying capacity, okay? They're up against that theoretical limit, so in order to propagate their species into the future, they have to really invest a lot of parental care. So if we think about humans or elephants or other really large mammals, bears, etc., they have a type 1 survivorship curve, and they're close to their carrying capacity. Because they tend to be larger animals, they require a lot of energy, and that's going to put a limit on how quickly they can reproduce. So we call that K-type reproductive strategy or K selection. The K stands for carrying capacity, okay? In German, the word for carrying capacity starts with a K. So we say that these have a K reproductive strategy, or they are K selected. So these are animals that are going to invest a lot in their children because they're up against that theoretical limit, and the selective pressures in their environment, that evolutionary pressure, is basically like you need to really invest in your young to ensure that your species is going to survive. And these tend to actually be animals that live in pretty stable environments, and they can evolve to be a lot larger because they're in these relatively stable places. They have relatively stable food sources, etc. So if we come down here to our type 3 survivorship curve, we can equate this with what's known as R type or R selected or an R reproductive strategy. So R stands for rate. So these are really focused on having a lot of children. These animals, it may seem harsh when you think about something like a sea turtle that has all these kids, and then you see them trying to make it to the ocean and they get picked off and eaten by birds and all these different predators. But ultimately, that has to do with the fact that they're nowhere close to their carrying capacity, and also it's a very good strategy because they're not living in very stable environments. So if you focus on the rate of growth, you can have a lot of offspring, and that's going to ensure your species, because maybe you don't live in a very stable environment. Something happens, one of these like horrible density independent limiting factors happens, like a hurricane or a fire or whatever, and if you have a lot of offspring, then your species is going to survive because just by sheer numbers alone. So it seems harsh, but it's actually a really good reproductive strategy. And if we look at the history of life on Earth, the longest lived species, continuous species, actually use this R-type strategy. Okay, if you think about something like let me think, like a sponge has been around for 760 million years, or like the living fossil, the coelacanth. That thing has been around for 360 million years. Okay, or if we were to hop over to Delaware and look at some horseshoe crabs, they've been around for 500 million years almost. Or cyanobacteria have been around for 2 billion years. Okay, so R type is good. So that's all I have for you guys today. Stay curious. Bye.